Just over 1,500 years ago, a terrible disaster occurred in Europe. The Roman Empire ceased to exist. The fall of the empire was not sudden. Gradually, over the years, the Romans found it more and more difficult to hold back the barbarian invaders who threatened them. Finally, by around 476 AD, barbarian tribes, like the Visigoths, poured over the borders of the empire. Before long, the power of Rome was gone. For over 500 years, people inside the empire had lived in peace, security, and comfort. Now all that was lost, and the era historians call the Dark Ages was about to begin.
Well, the Dark Ages was invented as a term to describe the relative lack of knowledge that historians had about life after the Romans left Britain until really the Norman Conquest. But I don't think many people think it's a very helpful term today, because it suggests that everybody who was alive in that period was stupid and didn't know anything. Archaeologists have shown that in terms of buildings, in terms of objects, people had a very rich and diverse and interesting culture. So it wasn't Dark Ages at all. We know a lot about that period.
There's a couple of hundred years where the settlers come from the Germanic kingdoms, and Britain is in fact in a state of turmoil, and there's sort of re-establishment of settlements, and the Britons are driven back. And that is what classically is referred to as the Dark Ages. But beyond that, you get the beginnings of Anglo-Saxon society as we know it. Of course, the Anglo-Saxons are then threatened by the Vikings, and they disrupt the even tenor, if you like, of Anglo-Saxon life. And so it is, in fact, a continual surging, if you like, almost a sea-like movement of disruption, civilization, settled patterns of life, and then more disruption. It's an extraordinary period.
Monks and other churchmen were the guardians of learning in the Dark Ages. Usually, they were the only people who could read and write. Of course, many monasteries and churches were attacked during the Dark Ages, but in general, the monks were able to live quiet lives dedicated to prayer, learning, writing books, and creating works of religious art. King Alfred of Wessex, Alfred the Great, was a man who loved books and wanted his subjects to have the benefit of education, proper laws to live by, and, most important of all, peace and security. Unfortunately, Alfred ruled Wessex at a time when peace and security were luxuries. During his reign between 871 AD and 899 AD, there were only 7 years when he was not leading his army against the Danish invaders. The Anglo-Saxons spread terror and destruction wherever they went, but as long as Roman soldiers remained in Britain, there was a chance they could be controlled. But the Roman Empire in Europe was under attack, and when Rome itself was in danger, the soldiers were withdrawn to help defend it. Gradually, more and more Romans left Britain, and by about 426 AD, the last of them had gone. The Romans had occupied Britain for 4 centuries, and during that time, many Britons had become used to the comfortable, leisurely Roman way of life. They knew little about fighting and war. They needed allies to fight for them, and went for help to the warlike Germanic tribes from northern Europe. That included the Jutes from Denmark and the Anglo-Saxons from Germany. In other words, warriors from the same tribes as the ones already raiding Britain. It was a terrible mistake. Within a very few years, by 455 AD, the Anglo-Saxons were taking the Britons' lands by force and throwing them out of their farms and homes. All the Britons could do was retreat further and further westwards. 70 years passed before the Anglo-Saxons were stopped by a British leader, who became the most famous character in Dark Age Britain. Later, he was known as King Arthur. In his History of Britain, written between 796 AD and about 830 AD, the Welsh chronicler Nennius described how Arthur led an army to 11 great victories over the Anglo-Saxons. Then, in a great battle at a place called Mount Badon in about 516 AD, the Saxons suffered a very heavy defeat. This, though, was not the end of the fighting. 20 years later, Arthur was killed in yet another battle at Camlan.
There are very few documentary sources that refer to him, and those that do are very late. They're written down centuries after the supposed King Arthur really existed. So I think we have to take his existence with a pinch of salt. However, the documentary sources and the archaeological sources do suggest that the Britons did put up a moderately successful fight against the Anglo-Saxons in the 5th century. And it may be that there were some British war leaders who led armies against the Anglo-Saxons, somebody like King Arthur, but whether there was ever a real King Arthur or not is a matter for dispute.
We know that he was a considerable personality of his time, that he had quite a considerable standing army, that he used to great effect against the somewhat sort of, I suppose you could call them scattered, Anglo-Saxon incursions. And he obviously was a charismatic leader. But having said that, I mean, so much more is accretion. And the archaeology, I mean, the sites that are associated with him are very sort of ephemerally associated with him.
It seems that 30 years of peace followed Arthur's death, but in 571 AD, there were more attacks by Angles, Jutes, and Saxons. And this time there was no British leader to stop them. Within another 30 years, the invaders were occupying most of England. All the Britons had were lands in the West Country and Wales, on the edge of the land they had once owned. Meanwhile, the Jutes set up a kingdom in Kent. The Saxons settled in Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. The Angles occupied Mercia, Northumbria, and the lowlands of East Anglia. In 625 AD, Raedwald, king of East Anglia, died. Raedwald had been a very powerful king, expanding his territory over most of southern England. This was why he was given a magnificent funeral. In 1939, at Sutton Hoo, archaeologists found what some believed was King Raedwald's burial place, the remains of his ship filled with the most splendid treasures. It was, and still is, the most magnificent display of Dark Age riches ever found in Europe.
A lot of people come here imagining that they're going to see a ship. But in actual fact, what was found here were ship rivets that survived very well, of course, because they're base metal. And the ship mould, rather like a sandcastle, the mould of a ship was unfurled. Even the gunwales of the ship, you could see the tholes where the oars would have actually been placed on either side. This king had great items of kingship. He had royal sceptre, a royal standard. There were items of great beauty within the burial chamber, textiles, carpets, gold, silver. There were over 4,000 garnets set in precious metals, and we're told by the experts that they must have been cut by children because they were so minute that adults' hands would have been too big.
It was the extraordinary craftsmanship, the design element that goes into the making of things like the shoulder clasps, the purse lid, striking figural scenes which had never been seen before on any Anglo-Saxon object, and which took people totally by surprise, and it changed people's perception to a certain extent of what Anglo-Saxon kingship was all about. It gave a new perspective into the civilization, if you like, of an early Anglo-Saxon kingdom.
Within a century of Raedwald's death, Britain had become largely Christian. Churches and monasteries were built, and a great tradition of Christian learning began. One of the most famous Christian scholars was the Venerable Bede, who was born probably at Monkton near Jarrow in Northumbria in around 673 A.D. Bede spent most of his life, from the age of 7 until his death in 735 A.D., as a monk at Jarrow. As a scholar and writer, he was extraordinary. He wrote hymns, poetry, books on science and astronomy, and he spoke Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. His most important work, though, was his Ecclesiastical History of England, written in about 731 A.D. Bede's history was later included in the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, a huge work of history which took 3 centuries to produce. The chronicle was written by hand by several churchmen in monasteries all over England. It begins with the reign of the first Roman emperor, Augustus, after the year 29 BC, and ends nearly 1,200 years later in 1154, the year King Henry II came to the English throne. Made up of 7 different manuscripts, including Bede's, it was probably put into shape by King Alfred of Wessex as part of his efforts to bring culture and learning to his war-torn kingdom.
The Anglo-Saxon chronicle is very important. It has informed a lot of our understanding. But archaeologists are aware, and I think historians too are aware, that the Anglo-Saxon chronicle is not an entirely consistent document. There are several versions that were written, and there are discrepancies in different versions. So you have to read it with care and understanding, but it really does provide a very useful background.
Although they do purport to tell us about what happened in the early Anglo-Saxon period, the period of Anglo-Saxon paganism, they don't really have very much secure information. They only come into their own as we get into the 8th and 9th and 10th centuries, and then they begin to tell us about current events and things the compilers actually knew about. And at that point they do become an extremely important source for Anglo-Saxon political and religious history.
There are blow-by-blow accounts of battles, or descriptions of cold winters, ruined crops, and the misery the people suffered. But one of the most dramatic of all the entries in the Anglo-Saxon chronicle was the entry for the year 793 A.D. In this year, fierce, foreboding omens came over the land of Northumbria, and wretchedly terrified the people. There were excessive whirlwinds, lightning storms, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. The signs were followed by great famine, and shortly after, in the same year, on the 8th of January, the ravaging of heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through brutal robbery and slaughter. The heathen men were the Viking of Scandinavia, the savage raiders who attacked and pillaged settlements not only in England, but also in Europe. They killed the inhabitants or carried them off as slaves and destroyed monasteries and churches. In 793 A.D., the Vikings certainly knew what they were looking for, because the monastery on Lindisfarne, founded in 635 A.D., was full of riches. Fortunately, there was one treasure they missed: the glorious illuminated manuscript known as the Lindisfarne Gospels. The Lindisfarne Gospels, that is, the Gospels according to the evangelists Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written on 248 pages of white vellum, or dried calfskin. The artist's name was Eadfrith, who wrote in Latin, and took many years to complete his masterpiece. He finished it on the 20th of March, 698 A.D. Eadfrith painted marvelous decorations in brilliant colors, full-page illustrations, and beautiful lettering. It was a labor of love, the love of God, as well as a great work of art. Eadfrith painted portraits of the four evangelists using many different colors: red, yellow, indigo, more than one pink, purple, and the brilliant blue known as lapis lazuli.
The Lindisfarne Gospels are an amazing artistic achievement. They were the product of one of the monastic scriptoria of the north, and they provide us with an example of some of the exquisite craftsmanship and workmanship, as well as the education available to monks in northern Anglo-Saxon England. They're also very interesting because they show a number of different artistic influences. They show Irish influence, they show insular Anglo-Saxon influence, a little bit of Pictish influence, as well as influences from the continent, from the Roman world. So they show that the Anglo-Saxon monks who constructed this wonderful manuscript were in touch with a much wider world, that Anglo-Saxon England wasn't just a small isolated pocket, but was part of a big ecclesiastical world.
The Lindisfarne Gospels, now in the British Museum in London, is one of the very few illuminated manuscripts to survive the Dark Age in Britain. But apart from its importance as a work of art and an example of religious devotion, there is something else of great interest about the manuscript. Between the lines of Latin text written by Eadfrith, there is a translation in Old English. The translation was made by a monk called Aldred. Latin, of course, was the language of the Christian Church. Old English was the language spoken by people in Anglo-Saxon England. Gradually, over many centuries, Old English developed into the English language spoken today. People who speak the same language usually belong to one nation, but the English were very far from being one nation in the 7th century A.D. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been rivals, and often enemies, for a long time. Many of their quarrels concerned the borders of those kingdoms, so that a king who meant to remain in power had to guard his borders very carefully. This was why Offa, king of Mercia, built a massive fortification to defend his territory from attacks by the Welsh.
As far as we know, as the name implies, it was built by King Offa of the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia. Mercia was one of a number of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had emerged in Britain after the end of the Roman period here. And by the 8th century, when Offa's Dyke was built, Mercia was really the most important of those kingdoms. So in that sense, that does give us a context to understand Offa's Dyke. Offa is the most powerful monarch of his day. We know, for example, that he's building contacts with not only other Anglo-Saxon kings, but also with people in Europe, principally with Charlemagne, who's developing his sort of Frankish empire at the same time. So Offa is a king on the make, looking to not only protect his realm, but I think demonstrate his own power. And I think when we begin to try and understand Offa's Dyke, that's really some of what it's about.
Parts of this great fortification, known as Offa's Dyke, can still be seen today. When it was first built in around 790 A.D., it ran 270 kilometers from Chepstow on the River Severn to the estuary of the River Dee. The dyke, one of the great technological marvels of Dark Age England, was 18 meters high, with a ditch 3.5 meters deep on the Welsh side. Today, the line of the dyke still marks most of the border between England and Wales.
In terms of how it functioned as a barrier, and indeed why it was built as a barrier, it's pretty obvious to argue that, Offa was trying to keep out the people who live in what is now Wales. But I think you've also got a sense that we're up here in quite a remote area. There's no evidence that Offa's Dyke was ever patrolled or fortified in the same way as, for example, the earlier Roman Hadrian's Wall was. And in fact, if you wanted to cross the Dyke, you probably could have done so. I think it's really probably about Offa, quite literally, drawing a line in the landscape, making it a political statement and really warning people that, if you cross this earthwork, well, you've got a really well-organised political and military system on the other side of this earthwork, and you're probably going to end up paying for that.
King Offa died in 796 AD, and by that time England was under threat from a people far more dangerous than the Welsh. When Lindisfarne was attacked by the Vikings in 793 AD, there was shock and terror in England. As the Northumbrian scholar Alswin wrote, "Never before has such a horror appeared in Britain. Behold the church of St. Cuthbert, sprinkled with the blood of the priests of Christ, robbed of all its ornaments. Here is the beginning of woe and calamity." Alswin was right. The raid on Lindisfarne was only the first of many savage Viking attacks. But it was not only the violence of these raids that terrified people in England. It was also the fact that the Vikings had been able to sail across the North Sea from their Scandinavian homeland. As Alswin himself put it, no one thought them capable of making such a journey. The Vikings were capable of making such a journey because they were magnificent sailors. They loved the sea and had beautiful names for it, like the silver necklace of the earth. They knew how to navigate by the stars and how to sail a straight course across the sea. Viking ships were open boats with a large square sail mounted on a mast made from a single tree trunk. But though they were simple, these ships were very strong. They were made from overlapping planks by the method known as clinker built. A Viking longship appearing on the horizon was one of the most terrifying sights for the peoples of Dark Age Europe. The shields ranged along its sides said all too clearly what it was, a warship. And the Vikings on board, up to 120 of them at a time, were coming to raid and destroy and pillage once again.
I think one of the key features of the Viking longships is the fact that they developed a very deep keel. They were clinker-built, overlapping planks like the earlier ships on both sides of the North Sea. But gradually, the Vikings developed a hull that was very flexible, was strengthened internally by an extra strake called the Meganhofer, and they also developed deep keels which bit into the surface of the water, which enabled their sailing skills to develop to quite a considerable extent.
The longships were particularly effective vessels because they could be both rowed and they could sail, and they could cope with coastal waters, just going round the coast. They could go up rivers. They were relatively light. I mean, a bit of hard work, but you could haul them up the rivers and a bit across land if necessary. And they could go across deep oceans.
They developed transports. They could carry goods. They could carry cattle. They developed seafaring far beyond anything that certainly the Anglo-Saxons did.
After 835 AD, the Anglo-Saxon chronicle recorded one Viking raid on England after another. Mostly these Vikings came from Denmark. After a while, though, the Danes were coming for more than treasure and plunder. They wanted to settle and live in England. At first, the Danish armies remained in England during the winter instead of going home. Soon afterwards, they were taking over Anglo-Saxon homes and farms. Before long, the Danes controlled more than half of England. In 878 AD, after they came to an agreement with King Alfred of Wessex, this area was known as the Danelaw.
The Danelaw is a term used to describe the area controlled by the Danes in England, where their law prevailed rather than the English law, the Anglo-Saxon law. And part of the reason why the Danelaw was established was to make sure that the English living within the Danelaw were properly protected and had a reasonable weregild, that is, they had a reasonable man price on their heads, so that they would receive a fair treatment in case of any criminal trial.
One of the Danes' greatest successes was the capture of the city of York in 866 AD. Danish York, or Jorvik, as they called it, lasted only 90 years before the kings of Wessex won it back. But by then the Danes had turned it into a rich and thriving city. After Alfred the Great died in 899 AD, the kings who came after him fought hard to win back the Danelaw, and in 954 AD, Eardred, Alfred's grandson, recaptured Jorvik. By this time, kings of Wessex were more powerful than ever before. They were recognized as kings of the English, with power over the whole land. Even so, the threat from the Vikings was not yet over. The attacks from Denmark and also Norway began again, and after 991 AD, Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, returned every year to devastate the countryside and terrorize the inhabitants. The Danes were offered Danegeld, a bribe of money and treasure, to make them go away. They took the bribe, but they always came back. Finally, in 1016, Forkbeard's son, Canute, became King of England, and until his death in 1035, England was part of his empire, which included the kingdoms of Norway and Denmark. Canute, as it happens, was a wise and strong king, but his successor, his son Hartha-Canute, was a brute, greatly hated by his subjects. Someone, it seems, hated him enough to poison him in 1042, and with his death, England returned to English kings. The first of them was King Edward the Confessor, who ruled England for the next 24 years. But the people Edward ruled were different from the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings of earlier times. They had settled down to live in England together. They spoke the same language and lived the same sort of lives. In other words, they were becoming one people and one nation, and later called themselves by one name, the English. Since prehistoric times, England had been invaded over and over again by peoples from Europe. After Edward the Confessor died, there was one more to come: the Normans. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy invaded England to claim the throne, which, he said, Edward had promised him. Once again, Viking longships were seen bringing warriors to the shores of England, for the Normans were descended from Vikings who had settled in France. But this time, it was different. The Normans were not raiders, and they were not settlers. They were conquerors. Before long, William of Normandy was King of England. He was a harsh, often cruel king, but a king with unshakable power and absolute control over his realm. With that, the long, dark age of raiding, lawlessness, violent rivalries, constant wars and battles, and constant suffering for the people of England came to an end.